is the Associate Dean, Partnership for the Faculty of Arts, and also a professor in the School of Social and Political Sciences, or SSPS, at the University of Melbourne. She teaches in the Master of Development Studies program and has a long history of collaboration in research, training, and also public engagement with Indonesian universities, government, and also in civil society organizations. So she was previously the director of the International for SSPS and also convened the University Indonesia Forum over multiple years, and formerly of the University of Oxford. Rachael continues to collaborate in research, teaching, publications, and public engagement, and other initiatives with colleagues in Melbourne, Indonesia, and of course, globally. Her present research focuses on two interrelated streams: the dynamic of rapidly changing context and also the implication for populations, the environment and also climate change, the governance and policy, and international developments, especially understanding poverty and inequalities, with a particular focus on inclusion, gender, and also empowerment. All right, Rachael, Prof. Rachael, so now the time is yours to deliver your keynote speech. And do let me know if you want us to help you in sharing the script, so we can do that for you also.
I'm happy to share my screen,
All
but
right.
Is that okay with you?
Yes, we are okay with that. Yeah.
Thank you very much to the organisation committee for having me. This is very exciting to be able to join you all, and hi to everybody who has joined the session. This is really great. I'll just share my screen. You see, there we go. Okay, so hopefully, is that okay? Can you all see that?
I think you must put it in the slideshow, so you can click the three dots there. It's because it shows on the presenter decks, the previous. Yeah.
Do you want me to try this one? Play from the start?
Mm-hmm.
Can you see now?
It's still in the presentation deck.
Let me try the three dots. Swap displays. How's that?
Yes, no, it's perfect. Yeah. Okay.
Wonderful. Thank you. So I wanted to share a little bit of information today on a project I'm engaged with on building durable responses to gender inequality. It's global in orientation, but it draws a lot of research from our experience in Indonesia, and it's research that I've collaboratively developed with Universitas Gadjah Mada and many other partners, including Kopernik, which is based in Bali. Let me just click. So the premise of this research is, how do we build durable responses to gender inequality? So how do we shape equality? What are our goals, and what shapes that? So one of the really important things that's been happening is, as we all know, both here in Australia, but also in Indonesia, gender equality is a really fundamental goal. And it's something that is pursued by governments of Indonesia, by governments of Australia, by lots of civil society organisations or non-government organisations, and by international organisations. And indeed, Australia and Indonesia have both signed up to the Sustainable Development Goals. It's in the long-term plans of the RPJMN in Indonesia. It's also in Australia's different development plans. But one of the biggest challenges is that Indonesia was making great progress on working towards improvements in gender equality. It had achieved, actually, under the UN measures that you might see with UNDP or Indonesia's own measures, it achieved at what was be called a medium level of gender equality, which is great advancement, actually. Lots of wonderful work had been done by government, by CSOs and others in Indonesia. However, just like in Australia and other countries, globally, there was quite a lot of backsliding in that progress that had been made because of the COVID-19 pandemic. So this is not something specific to Indonesia, this is happening globally. And what actually the World Economic Forum found was that by 2021, towards the end of the pandemic, all of the progress that had been made on gender equality and closing the gender gap we still had a lot of work to do. It was another sort of long generation, but the change, we lost nearly 36 years of progress that had been made, reversed because of all the challenges of the stay-at-home rules and other interventions that were halted because of the pandemic. So what we saw with the pandemic was this, what I would call a critical juncture. There was lots of great programs that were being done in Indonesia and around the world to build women's empowerment. And those, especially where there'd been a lot of support for women's groups, there was actually quite a lot of wonderful indicators of how those women's groups pivoted during the pandemic and showed resilience based on the skills that they gained in responding to the pandemic. So what we saw was really, women's groups, helping with the health response, changing their business structures, developing masks, all sorts of great things that were being done. But at the same time, because of the stay-at-home rules, we saw some women's groups' activities halt. We tended to see on the COVID-19 task forces in villages in Indonesia, there was a lot more men on those, even though there was strong women's groups in the village, and some regression, in different sorts of spaces. And in some places, everything the whole system collapsed. So what we've been trying to do is generate some comparative evidence from across Indonesia on how gender equity and empowerment initiatives help build women's resilience to shocks like the pandemic or a natural disaster or food insecurity or famine or all sorts of political change. That's a shock as well. So not only what helps build women's individual resilience, but also broader structural change that is durable. So if there is a future shock, the prior hard work that's been undertaken is able to remain and doesn't go backwards. So just a quick little concept definition. We understand resilience as the decisions and resources that enable long-term well-being and welfare, and that's often at the individual level, but it's basically how you build skills for individuals to bounce back from shocks. So you can think about this in terms of poverty as well. There's when people are in poverty, sometimes you are able to gain some sort of income or opportunity that helps you get out of poverty, but lots of people remain just on the poverty boundary, and it only takes one small shock and you're back in poverty again. And it's not dissimilar with efforts in improving women's empowerment. And so that's one aspect. And the other aspect is also more the durability of intervention. So when we do work in inclusive governance, in new policies on, improving, closing the gender gap in pay, for example, how do we make sure that that's sustainable and doesn't reverse every time there's a political change or other sort of shock that might challenge those policy or institutional changes that we've seen happen before? So those are the two things that we're looking at. A really good example of resilience is the way that, for example, in Deli Serdang in Sumatera Utara, in Indonesia, there's a program there that's run by one of our research partners called Bitra. They work with informal home workers. They've been doing a lot of support for those women to organise, so they got better pay and conditions. But in the pandemic, those women were able to really rapidly respond to produce PPE equipment, which they wouldn't have been able to before because they hadn't been working in a collective kind of way. So that was really, really great, seeing that example of resilience when the shock of pandemic happened. An example of durability is where the PECA women's group, PECA is the Female-Headed Houses Union. So these unions had been set up in lots of places, small women's groups supporting female-headed households who are often some of Indonesia's most poor and vulnerable. During the pandemic, while other groups in villages stopped collaborating, these women were able to continue their savings and loans activities, even via WhatsApp and other sorts of things. While they weren't meeting in person, they were still able to do activities together that distributed money to keep women afloat. So the idea of the group continued during the pandemic. It didn't stop or reverse and slowly peter away. So they're two different examples of resilience and durability. And so when we're thinking about this resilience, we can think about it at the individual level. So what are my skills, my personal qualities? How do I grow the knowledge, capacities, and all those intrinsic or soft skills over time that help me have my ability to cope with shocks when they happen, but also of groups. How do we act in solidarity, form networks, support each other to overcome problems and continue to do so into the future, as well as institutionally? How do we make sure that policies don't change with every, or rules don't change, or perdes don't change with, you know, every new leader? It creates a lot of insecurity, instability.
Recording stopped.
Reverses some of the challenges which have happened. So these are the different ways we can think about resilience.
Recording in progress.
And so what we've done is we've designed this program. We look at lots of different places, lots of different types of groups, and we trace the individual pathways, group pathways, and institutional pathways that help
Recording stopped.
influence the context within which women live, different villages, different districts, and not only achieve some short-term increases in improvements of gender equity, like, for example, more livelihoods for women, but really long-term durable increases, for example, well-being,
Recording in progress.
gender relations, as well as more inclusive institutions. So we've done this work with multiple different methods: FGDs, life histories, in-depth interviews, perception surveys, observation. This is work that's still ongoing with our partners. And here's some of the findings that we found. So we've been doing this research now for something like, we began in late 2018 and we've got ongoing research till 2027. So it's a very longitudinal study. So pre-pandemic, we found that, Indonesia, there's very, very different districts and village contexts. And so in one place, it might be quite gender inclusive, or there might be quite gender norms may encourage women to participate in village life. But in other places, there may be very little attention in district policy to inclusion in parliaments or in offices of the government or in the leadership positions. And equally, you might see very few women attending musdes or musrenbangdes. So you can have really, really different contexts. And that impacts the opportunities for women, and it shapes gender norms. And these vary right throughout Indonesia and indeed throughout the world. So the context can shape the institutions that affect women, power structures, how willing leaders are to be gender inclusive. It affects the sorts of needs and priorities and how well these are aligned with development planning, and also the sorts of social networks and groups that exist. But within these very different contexts, where there's all sorts of women's groups and sometimes very few women's groups, we've found that there's a few different ways that women's empowerment initiatives actually shape change. So the three main pathways that we've found are interventions that support women's empowerment, help grow grassroots agency for women and the ways that they can act collectively. And that's something that's common across all those different contexts. We've also found that when civil society organisations, LSM yang khusus memfokus pada pemberdayaan perempuan, so those really specific sorts of NGOs, they're not all the same, but some that really focus on growing women's skills and power, that can help with the process of empowerment and improving gender equity over time, as well as the strategies that CSOs use to collaborate with government policymakers and others to improve institutional structures, gender budgeting, musrenbang perempuan, special ways that make sure women are involved and have a role in public life and that their needs are met and not determined by others, but they actually have the agency and autonomy to shape their own outcomes. And the ways these three sorts of interventions contribute to growing skills, knowledge, networks, all sorts of different different ways and capacities for women to have influence. And together we found that this has a really positive outcome for village development. It helps create rules which are more, or things like perdes and task forces and other sort dana desa allocations. It helps shape village norms that are helpful for improving gender equality. So we found lots of examples where norms are slowly changing over time, even in some of the most difficult contexts. And it also makes sure that development funds are allocated to really diverse outcomes. We found that, when you make sure women are involved in decision making, not decided for, and actually have a say in village development, you get really wonderful, diverse development outcomes that affect everybody and are important for everyone. We found really different sorts of projects where women are involved in Worcester's decision making. You would see things like, instead of just roads projects or infrastructure, which is what Dana Desa tends to be spent on, we'd find things like solar power to villages that were helping charge all manner of households, hapes, which could then be used for livelihoods or small businesses and so on. We found different sorts of diversified livelihood options. And we found things like CLIck, the program CLIck, which was making sure that poor people, women and men and everybody, were getting access to ID cards, katepe processing in villages, legalisation of marriage, because the women were organising those services to be brought to the village. So it wasn't just benefiting women, it was benefiting everyone. But that tended to be happening when women were involved in decision making, but everybody benefited. So there is a really important, it's not just for women that we make sure they're involved in these decisions that affect everybody. So over time, we found that not only did those three pathways in all these different contexts improve gender equity, but it didn't just influence village development, it actually slowly started to make contexts more gender inclusive, both at village and district levels. We found that when you think about how deep patriarchal norms might be in villages, if there's places where it's really difficult to focus on women's empowerment because there's long histories of women not having a role in public life, those highly, highly difficult contexts, you can't expect them to change overnight, but they do change over time. So you always have to think about the onset situation, what kinds of constraints there are for women, and trace changes over time relative to your starting point. So in our research, we grouped our villages by how difficult they were in terms of women's empowerment and achieving and working towards gender equity. Some were more conducive, some were less conducive. And the nature of the interventions were harder and longer and deeper and took a lot more time in the difficult contexts than they did in the easier ones. So using, for example, a monitoring and evaluation system, a traffic light system where you have everyone at the same starting point isn't quite fair, because the sorts of interventions that are needed in harder places require more time, more resources, and deeper kinds of investments that collaborate with women than in places where there's already processes of gender empowerment and women's empowerment ongoing. Then it might be a very light touch intervention. But we also found that over time, things can change. So just because you can do some work in, women's empowerment, might improve the condition of women, establish women's groups, districts might support new initiatives. With a change of leadership or other kind of shock like the pandemic, sometimes you can get some backsliding. We found that often when women's groups have been formed, they'll continue to advocate, but it's not an upwardly positive trajectory over time. Sometimes things can go backwards, which has led to our new research and some of the things that we're finding is most important for durable responses to gender inequality. The establishing and collaborating with women's groups, and this here we mean women's groups with diverse members, so not just elite women's groups, but women's groups where poorer women, people from people living with disability, people from vulnerable and marginal groups are comfortable participating, so inclusive groups. Establishing these sorts of groups, so think here the Peka women's unions or the Sekolah Perempuan in East Java that focus on poor women, not just elite women. The groups are what's proving to be most durable because it's building intrinsic sense of self-worth and confidence and new skills for the individual women, but it's also building networks of solidarity, friendship, support, so that together women can overcome new problems that emerge. They're not left alone. This is also probably holds for men's groups as well. But the collaboration helps build durable improvements in women's wellbeing, their collective power to act. We didn't see that backsliding as much as some of the other things. Deep and sustained collaboration with women's groups helps improve gender relations in households. It can be a bit rocky for a little while, but it does change over time. And where you had perdes or other sorts of policies, laws, institutions, it's not enough just to produce a new rule that says you must have, for example, 30% women's representation in a political party or in a village meeting. That's very impulsive. It's important because it helps incentivize change in norms. It helps incentivize leaders to act differently. It helps incentivize government, bureaucrats, village heads, other sorts of leaders to think about gender inclusion. But it's not enough alone, because in lots of places gender norms are so deeply ingrained that it's really easy to circumvent those rules and discourage women informally from participating. Because what you're asking women to do is to challenge their social networks by doing things differently. So we need the rules, but it's not enough. We also need sort of broader collective action altogether. So our key findings to date, and this is ongoing work, is that when you do long-term interventions, 1 year program on women's empowerment is unlikely to have durable, lasting effects. But, 5-10 year programs are the ones that are having the deepest impacts. And there's always a trade-off in collaborating with fewer groups more deeply versus a sort of wide approach, but not very long-term or not much investment. We've also found that it's the groups themselves, establishing that group structure is proving most durable. Where there's been strong women's groups, they've continued to organise regular activities. So we've gone back to places where programs have stopped that were running before the pandemic. And where those programs worked with inclusive women's groups, those groups were still going, even though the programs and the funding had stopped. And the women's leaders were still deeply engaged in sharing skill with other women in the village. The knowledge still remains. There's still a sort of a sense of solidarity, and it's increasing. So those are some of the aspects which were proving most durable. Similarly, we found where there were efforts to institutionalise policies, new village laws, regulations, dana desa allocations. This tended to also be durable. It was still there after the pandemic, even when programs supporting women's empowerment had stopped. And finally, in terms of resilience, we found that that real work to do build women's confidence, public speaking skills, and I'm talking here with the poorest of the poor women who may never have even gone to a village meeting. There's a lot of programs that do work to increase the self-confidence, grow their skills, practice public speaking, do business management, other sorts of things that some of the poorest women in Indonesia had never experienced before. And that was very helpful for the long-term impact on their resilience to respond to problems as they emerge. Because the knowledge remained, so did the networking capacity, financial literacy, and other sorts of skills. So there is a real benefit to not just investing in livelihoods for women's empowerment programs, but a lot of that training and capacity building that grows women's own agency. So I guess some of the bigger lessons to date, and this, like I said, this research is ongoing, is, you know, Indonesia is highly variable, as is many countries, and some places are much slower to change, especially when gender norms are quite patriarchal and quite deep. But so we should measure change against our starting points. It'll be slow and incremental. Maybe policies and rules will change quicker, but the slowest thing to change are some of those norms, especially on issues of cultural taboo, like women's reproductive health and other sorts of things like that. And the interventions you need will be harder, deeper and slower in those more difficult places, and might be more light touch in other places. We can't measure performance of all villages in the same way. Rules are an important incentive, but they're insufficient alone. Strategies that focus on embedding gender inclusiveness, women's empowerment in other sorts of policies, rules and norms do have lasting effects, as does a focus on collaboration via groups, because that helps build the power and influence of women collectively on things that matter to them, especially for really vulnerable women. And also things can backslide, so don't expect that change is lasting. We need to keep an eye on this. So just to wrap up, you know, this is the current iteration of our research, involves 8 partners. We had 15 partners for the pre-pandemic research, and with an Australian research grant in collaboration with Gajah Mada and others, we are looking at this long-term study of durability and resilience in terms of equity and women's empowerment in Indonesia, and there's lots of lessons here for globally, which we've been trying to share. So it's really wonderful to be able to share this with you today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Prof. Rachael, for sharing with us, and also particularly related with building a durable response to gender inequality based on your, perhaps it's the last or what years the collaboration has happened?
So before the pandemic, we began before the pandemic, late 2018. University of Melbourne, Universitas Gajah Mada, and 15 partners in Indonesia, supported by MAMPU, the Women's Empowerment and Gender Equality Initiative. That was a collaboration between the Australian and Indonesian governments. Very great program. We then continued this research with 6 or 7 of those partners. It's ongoing until 2027 with the support of the Australian Research Council grants. That's a 9 years program. So
yeah, 9 years.
So I'm showing you some of the early results. But we have a website. I'll put it in the chat for everybody, where you can see the published work to date. demisetara.org, and you can go and find the
Demi Setara. All right. Okay. In Indonesia, or in English, it's for the equalities, actually. Demi Setara. Setara. Yes. All right. Okay.
It's Anaja. That's the website. So you can find a lot of our pre-pandemic research that's already been published there. Okay,
because interesting, because the program and the collaborations, so it's interesting also because it's related with Dr. Ayu mentioned earlier in the previous keynote speech, because not most, but many of the gender equality is based on the research collaboration. It's come with the, what's it called, the project goals. Yeah, the project goals, but it comes to the non-negotiable principle, yeah, of the governance. So we are on the pathway of doing that. So it's interesting to see how your research collaboration among with all the stakeholders involved, it's committed, because the hardest part, I think, is the commitment to carry on, right?
And also it's very, very rare Often when you have women's empowerment programs, they're from, 1 year, 2 year, 3 years.
Yeah.
Often if there's any research on those programs, it's at the beginning, maybe a midpoint and the end of the program. No one goes back to see what's there later after.
Exactly. Yes.
So this research is showing you what is remaining when programs end. And that's what I was talking about with groups, with the skills for women, with the networks of solidarity. We're finding they're still doing activities in the places where the work was deep, where it was quite light touch, a little bit of money for livelihoods or whatever. There are some impacts. They're really, though, at the individual level, not at the broader social level.
Yes, it's true. It's true. Thank you so much also for inspiring us in this Diprose 2025, Rachael. All right. So I think we have a live question and it's coming from Dr. Yesi Crosita. So please welcome, Doc. The time is yours if you want to ask the live questions. Right. The committee can give the access. Okay. Hold on. Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Prof. Rachael, from your insight. You can consider this a lazy question, but I do need your insight on this one. From my previous research in rural female farmers in Cianjur, there are two things that I also found in your research, that the key for durability of what lasting is groups and networks, right? And what I found is actually there are social capital and time poverty experienced by the younger generation of women in that particular setting. So my lazy question is, from your perspective and your experience, how can you address this social capital poverty and time poverty to build this network and groups beyond the short-term intervention?
So, and I hope I understand your question correctly. We found that when you're commencing new interventions, particularly around, if the focus is on women's empowerment and you're working with some of the poorest of the poor, you really need to find incentives that are practical for the women to participate in the first place. You cannot expect poor women with caring responsibilities. So, for example, if we take female-headed households, one of the most vulnerable and stigmatized groups in Indonesia, they experience a lot of shame and humiliation because of their poverty, because maybe their husband has divorced them or migrated for TKI and never come back, or whatever those things are. So there's a lot of shame and stigma. So even getting them to come to an initial meeting to hear the program of activities is extraordinary. And that's where we found that the work of CSO partners, their slow work of building trust, of encouraging the women to participate, but also incentivizing them, making sure that the activities have practical benefits for the poor, as well as the capacity building activities. Then you'll find slowly, with the practical benefits continuing, it's worth women giving up their time poverty, whether they're young, old, or otherwise, that because of that poverty, and they might be time poor, or finding ways to, it's not just about babysitting their kids, but inclusive ways that they can participate, so bring their kids along to the meeting or whatever it is. But also that the activities themselves are quite practical. Through those activities and adding on skills building, you get the networks developing, savings and loans activities, other sorts of things. So they're doing two things at the same time: building skills, building networks, but also providing practical benefits. Over time, you'll find then that the women want to participate and will make the time, because of all of those dual benefits and the sort of solidarity, friendship, intrinsic benefit that they gain. And then when new problems come up, so for example, we had examples from the Sekolah Perempuan in Jatim, where the work of Kapal Perempuan and other partners, the Sekolah Perempuan it's a women's school, but it's an informal women's school. And, they were doing work in women's health and other sorts of things. And they, one group member would go when the other another member was worried that she might have breast cancer or something, too scared to go to the doctor, but the group would go with her, and so she was getting that collective benefit of being in the group, of solving her problems, and over time that becomes mutually compounding, and that's where we started to see the longer term durable impacts. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I hope it's in the right direction.
Yeah, basically finding the right incentive for that particular context, right? So
yes, but
that's
also
the search began.
incentive, support. Don't expect them to, don't just say go to the musters, and when you have people shame, why are you here? Women don't normally come to this. You need to go together, you need to do it collectively, and not just give money, but actually do the skills building at the same time. So you need both practical incentives as well as the collaboration aspects.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Yesi. Okay, so do we have any other questions coming from the participants in the Zoom chat box? Okay, for the website, yeah, it's already corrected. Thank you, Prof. Rachael. Yes, the Misataraya. Yes, correct. Okay, so I think while waiting for I think we still have around a few minutes. Yeah, a few minutes more. So once again, to all of the participants in the GCRIS 2025, if you want to ask the question to Prof. Rachael, feel free to type it in the Zoom chat box, or if you want also to ask in the live mode, so you can also raise the hands. All right, so I think these research collaborations is the one that you shared in the keynote speech is inspiring. And yes, some of the, I want to talk, but I should give the opportunity to the participant who will ask the questions. Okay, Prof. Rachael? All right, so it's coming from, yes, please welcome Ibu Ati, or Dr. Ati or Miss Ati. The committee can give the access? Yes, okay. Yes, you already, you can unmute and you can start to, if you want to ask the questions. Ibu? Yeah. Still, we cannot hear your voice. Have you already connected the audio, ma'am? Because we cannot hear the voice, or perhaps you can type the questions in the Zoom chat box. Okay, all right.
Santai saja.
Okay, santai saja. Your bahasa is really good. So, how long that you live in Indonesia?
I live in Australia now, but I lived there for maybe 10 years, between 1999 and 2014. Yeah.
Oh, that's why. Okay, fantastic. Yes. Okay. I have a questions. Okay, I have a direct questions. It's coming from Monique Emil Ratunil. So she sent me questions. So all right, the questions to Prof. Rachael. In what ways can communities continually adapt their strategies so that progress toward gender equality remains strong and long-lasting?
Great question. One of the concepts that we come up with in our research is what we call women's networked collective action. It sounds like a little bit of a tautology, but what we mean by this is that when some of the best ways that women's empowerment and long-term pathways towards improvement in their well-being and gender equity are actually in collaboration with men and communities. So women aren't the ones that create these norms that are exclusionary. That's often a community norm that sort of designates roles to genders and the old and young and all the different ways that we put people in groups. And it's actually our collective responsibility to try and change these norms. So that includes things like, community efforts to create spaces that women feel safe and comfortable sharing their views in. We've got lots of case studies on our websites of really great efforts of women to have a bigger influence and say in decisions that affect them, to turn up to village meetings on the encouragement of whatever village members, but then to be shamed by other village community members for trying to participate. It is a huge barrier. Social norms are a huge barrier to improving, making durable responses to gender inequality, because you can try and change the rules, but until we sort of create the spaces which are inclusive, which is all of our collective responsibility, it's very, very hard for women to do it themselves, particularly if they're poor and have long been excluded. So I'm not discounting the capacity or agency of women to make change. I'm saying we make it harder as a society when we don't try and be more inclusive and change those norms. So I think it's, so that's one of the ways. Others are to recognise that you sometimes need to create affirmative action and other sorts of incentives to try and correct the inequality, even if it's only temporary, to sort of catch up, if you like. So that's why there's things like quotas or allocations. It's why the gender quota in Indonesia, if in the electoral system, is starting to see more women in positions now. You know, I don't know if it'll be needed it's getting more traction. We don't have that in Australia, and we haven't had enough women in Parliament either. So it's not exclusive to Indonesia. So I think it's our collective responsibility to think about this both in policy and practice, but also in our everyday social relations. And if we see behaviour that's exclusionary, to try and correct it.
All right, thank you. And yes, I think it's already answered the questions from Monique Emeline Retudil. I think it's from Philippines, Prof. Rachael. All right, and I think we have two more questions. One is going to be the live questions, and the other is from Ibu Ati. Yeah, the previous ones. Okay, so I'm going to address the question from Ma'am Ati. So the question is, Prof. Rachael, please kindly describe briefly if there was progress in areas where local leaders strongly resisted women empowerment. Yeah, I think it's happening quite a lot.
Yes, great question, Buati. So yes, we found, so those findings where I showed the 3 pathways, those were 3 things interacting and occurring at the same time, which we found were common across some of the most difficult contexts and some of the more conducive contexts. But there was 3 there. One was women's own agency and collective action, the things that they did themselves as in the women's groups, they grew their own skills and capacities and so on. But what was absolutely fundamental and helpful in those really difficult contexts was the role of civil society organisations and policy in trying to break down some of those barriers to women's empowerment. So let me give you 2 examples. There was a couple of places where, say, for example, village heads didn't support a particular program. A number of things that really worked were the CSOs that were supporting the women did long, slow trust building with the village to sort of say, look, this isn't just about women. This is about these activities actually benefit everyone. So a really good example is the work of Pekka in Bangkalan. You know, they did a lot of slow work to show that the kinds of activities that they're talking about were not a threat to the village power or the village leaders, that actually the programs they're introducing, they did lots of work to, you know, in providing KTP cards or documentation of marriage, those sorts of services that villagers couldn't access, not just women, but everyone couldn't access because they were too remote and too far away from government, actually benefiting everyone. That helped build trust. It helped show the village these things were collaborative and positive. And slowly those prior resistant leaders actually supported the program. And over time, they continue to collaborate with the women. But I think what was instrumental there was, you know, those women's groups in those kinds of contexts really needed a lot of support. They had quite regular interaction with the civil society organisations. Often they'd live in or live nearby the village until it got to a point where this is for over a few years actually, until things started to be able to operate on their own. And the other work was to do some work at the policy and advocacy level. And so, you know, for example, in East Java, there was some resistance at village level to some sekolah perempuan, but Bapeda and others in the district really saw the benefits of the program, and so they did the advocacy work to say, hang on, let's give this a go, and so they intervened to support, so the women's groups and the women's CSO sought the support of others, and then they kind of helped unblock some of those barriers, and then there was some great progress. And that sekolah perempuan's now being rolled out right across almost all villages in East Java. It's become so popular, even though there was resistance initially, but it did take trust building, slow work, deep support initially to get to the point where things were able to continue in a more regular way, I guess you could say.
Thank you,
Yes.
Professor. Thank you very much. Very interesting.
You can
Okay.
feel that in our reports on the website, actually. We compare different places and where you've got deep resistance, what sorts of strategies worked. This is all based on evidence from Indonesia. It's not me sort of saying, here's what you must do. I'm saying, here's what
Yeah.
we saw from the evidence worked. And then there's cases where if it's not quite so difficult, you could do a lighter touch approach. It doesn't cost as much in money or funds, resources or time, because the processes are already going, and anything you do will just speed them up.
Yeah. You cannot generalize anyway, right? Yeah. Thanks.
All right. Thank you so much, Ibu Ati. Thank you for asking the questions. All right. So I think we must come up with the final questions, and it's coming from our colleagues. Okay. So Dr. Adamu Abubakar Muhammad from Nigeria. So if you want to ask the live question to Prof. Rachael, please welcome.
Still on mute, I think.
Yeah, it's already. Yes. Yep. You can address the question, Doctor.
Okay. Good morning,
Good morning.
Mr. Moderator, and good morning, Prof. We really enjoyed your discussions, more especially concerning the women empowerment, not only in Indonesia, not only in Asia. Maybe this discussion can be benefited across the world. Sorry, here in Nigeria it's early morning because it's past 6 in the morning. That is why maybe you can't not see me clearly. And then if you are talking about the poverty, really Africa must be a center of concentration, because we are taking the larger share of poverty or vulnerables across the world. And if you are talking about Africa, still issue of poverty is more serious in the West African countries, more especially Nigeria. Nigeria is the most populous country in Africa, but we are taking a larger share of poverty across the African people. And then more especially if we are talking about the poverty, here in Nigeria, more especially in northern part of the country, women are more victims than the men. And then women are taking larger share of the population. Not only here in Nigeria, we are looking at this as across the world. It's the same problem. So here in Nigeria, women, they have low access to businesses, they have low access to financial issues, and always they are living inside the house, they are living together with their children, despite their capabilities and chances of running even in-house businesses or micro and small businesses. So they lack support either from their parents or from their husbands or from their senior children, at least to assist them with a little money to start their businesses either in-house or in front of their houses or in small places in their localities. So here what I want to ask or advise or share insight is there any possible collaboration from abroad in order to have even online interaction with the people who are living in these areas, to hear from them and hear what are the proposals with a little amount that they can use in order to improve women empowerment, youth empowerment, in terms of giving them a skills training or supporting them with a start-up business package, at least to eradicate serious poverty in these locations. Because here in Nigeria, you can find a woman to start a business and live on that business and earn profit from that business, but did she need a start-up package of only $10 to $50? Only $10 to $50. Once she has these $10 to $50, she will start her business and feed herself and at least assist her young children in order to enroll them in the school and minimum. So this is my idea. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Adam. Not sure which part of Nigeria. I have actually done research and lived in Nigeria for a little while, so I know exactly what you're talking about. I'm not entirely sure if that was an appeal for financial support, but there's lots of global networks and sharing of how things work. And I actually, in some of the most difficult in some of the poorer areas of Indonesia, they're not that dissimilar to poorer parts of West Africa, and still you can see progress. And I've seen lots of amazing women's initiatives also in West Africa, including in Nigeria and Ghana and elsewhere. I'm not sure if that's a question around how do you raise funds, because of course, there's the challenge in the Nigerian context is that there's wealth, but it's not equally shared. So I guess you could tap resources also and appeal for funds in the Nigerian context. There's also aid funds from Europe, the UK and elsewhere that do run women's empowerment programs. But I think the more important thing is around the learning of how those programs which do focus small amount of funds, but also collaboration, network, group establishment and so on, and assuming you have telecommunications and digital forms, you can also do sharing cross country. So here in Indonesia, there's often sharing with experience with the Philippines, Timor-Leste and others in how those things are having impact. So I guess I would say the important thing is to sort of establish a process by which to support women in a way that's group focused. And I think if you're seeking funds from outside, I mean, there's ways of knowing and doing. Well, there's a whole website of research there that you could gain ideas from and use that to shape Nigeria-specific, culturally specific programs rather than a one-size-fits-all based on the evidence in appeals for funding and so on, or collaborations or pilots that may ask for support from aid programs or even from within in Nigeria's own policy context in how to do this differently.
All right, so thank you so much, Prof. Rachael, for sharing and also giving your strategy, or what is it called, the practical tips, we can say, that the participant, and particularly to all of the colleagues, because our conference is not only participated by 5 or 6 or less than 10, but it is almost 15 countries, Prof. Rachael. So perhaps they also find a different challenge here in terms of the women empowerment or the gender equality issue itself. However, your keynote speech is really inspiring and also give us a lot of insight about how we can make a real impact, not only in the concept, not only in the concept, but how we can make a real impact to our society. So once again, thank you so much, Prof. Rachael, for sharing your thought, your expertise with us in the Diprose 2025.
You're very, very welcome. Thank you.
All right. Okay, so now it's the time for the appreciation moment. So as the recognition and also appreciation from the Diprose 2025 committee, we would like to give this special token of appreciations to our keynote speaker, Professor Rachael Diprose from University of Melbourne, Australia. So in this occasion, we would like to invite Dr. Dr. Yesi Krosita Oktaria, MIH, from Universitas Pembangunan Nasional Veteran Jakarta to give this special token of appreciation. So please welcome Dr. Yesi. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, thank you. Finally, it's unmuted. Yeah, we'd like to take a moment to express our sincere gratitude as on behalf of the committee for your presentation, insightful presentation, Prof. Rachael. And as a small token of appreciation, we would like to present this certificate of recognition for you. And thank you again for your valuable contribution in this particular event.
Terima kasih, Mbak. Saya sangat senang bisa berpartisipasi dalam konferensi ini, and thank you to everybody for taking the time to listen to my presentation. And hopefully, if you have a look at that website, it's really interactive and easy to use. It's drawing on Indonesia evidence, but it's trying to say, what do we do with that so we can trial it elsewhere? So hopefully we've tried to develop concepts and frameworks and videos and all the things that explain how change happens that I hope will be useful for everyone. So thank you very much for having me and giving me the opportunity to share it.
Thank you, Prof. Rachael. We actually go straight to your resources, and we're like, oh, this is the resources that we needed to map out what should we do to actually building a durable